I knew something was wrong before I even had the words to explain it. It wasn't a sudden revelation, like a lightning strike, but a slow creeping sense of unease that crawled under my skin and settled there, cold and unyielding. It's the kind of feeling that twists in your gut late at night when the world is quiet, and your thoughts have nowhere to hide. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. People in love do that, right? We see ghosts where there are none. I blamed my own insecurities, convinced myself I was being paranoid. But it wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. It started small. Too small to confront. I noticed how often he mentioned her name. Taylor. She was just a woman from his office, a name that used to blend in with the rest of his stories about work. But one day it didn't. It stood out. Like a high note in a quiet song. It lingered in the air longer than it should have. "She's funny," he said one night, chuckling as he scrolled on his phone. "She has this way of telling stories that just pulls you in." I laughed along with him, but my heart did this small involuntary shudder. Why did that bother me so much? I didn't know yet. Then the signs started multiplying. His phone was always face down. That wasn't unusual in itself, but he'd never cared about that before. Now he'd casually slide it out of view when I sat next to him. When I walked into the room, his thumb would flick a little faster across the screen. A fraction of a second too fast, as if trying to close something. "You're on your phone a lot these days," I said one evening, leaning against the kitchen counter as he scrolled through it, not even glancing up. "Just work stuff," he muttered, eyes glued to the screen. I told myself it was nothing. Nothing. But the human mind is a brutal machine. It notices things even when you beg it not to. One night, after dinner, he sat across from me at the table, swirling the last bit of red wine in his glass. We'd been talking about relationships. The topic had come up after we watched some TV show where a husband had an affair. I thought we'd laugh it off, maybe share some commentary about how ridiculous TV tropes were. But he didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned forward, eyes distant, lips pressing into a thoughtful line. "You ever think about it?" he asked. "About what?" I tilted my head. "Just being with only one person for your whole life. Feels unnatural sometimes, doesn't it?" He glanced up at me, his gaze sharp but calm, like he was measuring my reaction. My heart stopped. Physically stopped, like a held breath. "Don't overreact, don't overreact, don't overreact," I told myself, forcing my face to stay neutral. "No," I said, voice quiet but firm. "I never think about it that way." He shrugged, sipping his wine. I don't know. It's just a thought. A thought. A thought he hadn't had for the past 6 years of our relationship. A thought that suddenly emerged after his mysterious phone habits and his growing fondness for the way Taylor tells stories. I should have confronted him then. I should have asked, "Is there someone else?" But I didn't. I was afraid of the answer. The final crack came 3 days later. I walked into the living room and found it sitting on the coffee table like a loaded gun. A book. First, I didn't think much of it. He was always reading something new, picking up novels from used bookstores or getting recommendations from friends. But this book was different. The title stopped me in my tracks. The Art of Infidelity. I stood there, staring at it. My breath went shallow, my mind suddenly hyper-aware of every detail. The way it was placed so casually, like it belonged there. Like it was meant to be seen. I picked it up, my fingers brushing over the worn spine. I opened it. The first line of the synopsis made my heart collapse into itself. A provocative exploration of love, desire, and betrayal. I flipped through the pages, my eyes darting across the words. It was a story about a man who enters an affair and convinces himself that he's doing nothing wrong because he still loves his wife. My chest felt tight, and my breathing grew uneven. It wasn't just the story. It was the underlined passages. Yes, underlined. He had underlined parts of the book. Little notes in the margins in his handwriting. His handwriting. Sentences like, "Desire isn't a choice, it's an instinct." My stomach twisted. I felt like I was going to be sick right there on the living room floor. My fingers dug into the pages, nails pressing hard into the paper. Then I saw it. Her name. "You might like this one. Reminds me of our conversation last week, Taylor." My legs gave out and I sank to the couch, the book still in my hands. It wasn't just the book. It was the fact that she knew about it. She was the one who recommended it. The signs weren't signs anymore. They were warnings. Warnings I had ignored until they were too loud to drown out. I sat there for a long time, gripping the book as if it could answer my questions, as if it could scream back at me. My breathing was shallow, my hands clammy, my vision blurred with tears. He came home an hour later. I heard the jingle of his keys and the shuffle of his shoes at the door. The book was still in my lap. I hadn't moved. I stared at it, then at him. He saw me sitting there, eyes red, face blank. "Hey," he said slowly, his voice uncertain. "You okay? Are you with her?" I didn't even look up at him. My voice didn't shake, but it was hollow. It echoed in the room like I had spoken into a cave. Silence. Heavy, thick, unbearable silence. I lifted my head slowly. He stood in the doorway, frozen. His jaw tensed, his eyes dark with something I couldn't name but could feel like a weight pressing on my chest. It wasn't guilt. It was fear. "No," he said finally, the lie too smooth, too quick. But his eyes, God, his eyes, they darted to the book on my lap, lingered there a second too long. He knew. He knew I knew. I stood up slowly, the book still in my hands. I stepped forward until there were only inches between us. I tilted my head up, locking my gaze with his. "Don't lie to me," I whispered, and my voice cracked on the last word. "Don't you dare lie to me." His eyes flickered. For a moment I saw it, the truth pushing to the surface, fighting to get out. He didn't say anything, but his breath hitched just once. It was small, but it was enough. I don't remember much after that. I remember feeling like I was outside my body, floating above it all, watching this woman, me, staring down the man she'd loved for 6 years, watching her heart break in slow motion. He said something like, "You're being dramatic." And I laughed. I actually laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was a hollow, guttural sound that felt like it had been ripped out of me. Then I dropped the book at his feet. "Clean it up," I said, my voice ice cold. "Clean it all up." I walked away. Not because I was strong, but because I knew that if I stayed a second longer I would beg. I would beg him to love me again, to tell me I was wrong, that it wasn't what it seemed. But I'd seen his eyes. His eyes told me everything his mouth never would. I wish I could say I walked out that night and never looked back. I wish I could tell you I packed a bag, slammed the door behind me, and felt the rush of freedom wash over me like a tidal wave. But that's not what happened. Life isn't a movie, and people like me, people who have loved too deeply for too long, we don't just walk away. Not right away, at least. For the next few days I lived in a fog. Every little sound in the house felt sharper, louder. The clink of dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards as he moved around. They all felt like tiny needles pricking at my ears. I noticed everything now. Every glance he stole at his phone, every pause before he answered me, every time he sat just a little too far away on the couch. I hated myself for noticing. I hated that I had become this person. Suspicious, paranoid, hyper-aware. I felt like I was losing my mind, but the worst part was knowing I wasn't. I knew the truth. My gut had been screaming it for weeks, and now it was too loud to ignore. He didn't bring up the book. Neither did I. It sat on the shelf, back in its place like it was just another novel in our collection. Not a grenade that had gone off between us. But every time I walked past it, I felt it watching me. I knew he felt it too. He stopped looking at the shelf entirely. One night, a few days after I found the book, I stood in front of it, staring at the spine like it was some kind of cursed artifact. My fingers hovered over it, tempted to pull it out again, as if reading it one more time would give me the strength to do what needed to be done. I heard him behind me before I saw him. His footsteps were slow, cautious, the way you walk when you know someone is about to snap. "You're still thinking about it," he said quietly, leaning against the doorway. I didn't turn around. "Shouldn't I be?" He sighed, that long, tired sigh that men do when they want you to feel like you're the unreasonable one. "I told you it's just a book. Taylor recommended it, that's all. It doesn't mean anything." "She recommended it to you, or she recommended it to both of you?" Silence. That awful, suffocating silence. He stepped closer, and I felt his presence like a storm cloud moving in. He didn't touch me, didn't even try. "You're looking for something that isn't there," he said. His voice as calm as ever, like he had already decided he was in control of the story. "You're going to drive yourself crazy if you keep doing this." I finally turned to face him, my eyes locking with his. I stared at him so hard I swear I could see the cracks in his mask. "I'm not the one driving myself crazy," I said softly. "You are." His jaw clenched, and for the first time I saw it. Panic. He masked it quickly, blinking it away, but I caught it. It was there for just a second. A flicker of fear behind his eyes. And that was all I needed. He knew I wasn't stupid. He knew I wasn't going to let it go this time. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed next to him, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling while his breath rose and fell in the steady rhythm of sleep. Or maybe he was pretending. I didn't care. My mind was moving too fast, memories rushing in like waves crashing on the shore. Every little insignificant thing I'd ignored for the past few months suddenly seemed monumental. The dinner he canceled at the last minute. The sudden work events he didn't have time to explain. The fact that he'd started taking showers at night instead of in the morning. It all came together, like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. The next day I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for him to slip up again. I needed clarity, and I was done asking for it. When he left for work that morning, I waited 10 minutes before I went into action. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out, but I didn't stop. I grabbed his laptop from the kitchen table, the one he never used in front of me anymore. It asked for a password, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. My hands hovered over the keys for a second, my breath shaky, before I started typing. His usual password didn't work. I tried another. Then another. On the fourth attempt it opened. He'd used Taylor's name. I actually laughed out loud. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was bitter and sharp and ugly. The desktop was a mess of folders, documents, and apps, but I didn't have to search for long. People like him always think they're so clever. They think women like me won't connect the dots. He'd been too comfortable, too cocky. And that's why, after just a few clicks, I found it. A folder named Work Stuff. I opened it, half expecting to find spreadsheets or invoices, but instead I saw a row of images. Screenshots. Photos. Messages. I clicked on one at random, and there she was. Taylor. Blonde hair, wide smile, sitting on the edge of a desk with her legs crossed like she was posing for a magazine cover. His desk. His office. I clicked another. It was a screenshot of a text thread. Her. You always know how to make me laugh. Him. I'm just here to keep you smiling. Her. I could use more of that tonight. Him. Name the time and I'm there. I stopped breathing. My fingers hovered over the mouse. I read it again, then again, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. But it was real. It was all right there. My hands were shaking now, not from fear but from rage. A deep, molten rage that burned hotter than anything I'd ever felt in my life. I clicked more messages. I didn't have to. I'd seen enough, but I kept going because I wanted to be absolutely sure. The work dinners. The late meetings. The "I'll be home soon" texts that always came later than promised. It was all there. Their little secret world. Hidden in plain sight. I closed the laptop. My heart was racing, but I felt still. Strangely calm. Like something in me had snapped and the panic was gone. The fear was gone. I knew what I had to do. When he came home that night, I was waiting for him. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't even let him know I'd seen anything. "Hey," he said, tossing his keys on the counter. "You okay? You seem quiet." I smiled at him, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I'm good," I said, my voice light, easy. "Good," he said, already distracted, pulling out his phone like he couldn't bear to be away from it for more than 5 minutes. "Actually," I added, taking a step toward him, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." He glanced up, still scrolling. "Yeah." I stepped closer. Close enough to smell his cologne. Close enough to watch his eyes. I tilted my head just like I'd done before. "Are you with her?" I saw it. The pause. The flash of something behind his eyes. He could have lied, could have denied it like he always did, but this time he hesitated. It was only half a second, but that was all it took. "No," he said, his voice steady, too steady. I stared at him for a long, long time. "Okay," I said softly, still smiling. "Okay." But in that moment I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. 1, he was lying. 2, he would never see it coming when I left. The days that followed were a quiet kind of chaos. Not the kind that comes with shouting or broken dishes, but the kind that sinks into your bones and makes everything feel heavier. I moved through the house like a ghost, doing the bare minimum to keep things looking normal. Laundry, dishes, dinners. All of it mechanical. He didn't seem to notice. He thought I'd let it go. He thought I believed him. And why wouldn't he? I hadn't said a word about it since that night. I hadn't asked him any more questions, hadn't thrown accusations at him, hadn't cried. That was his mistake. He mistook my silence for surrender. But silence is not surrender. Silence is strategy. At night, I lay in bed next to him, my mind moving faster than it ever had. While his breathing stayed steady, his body loose with sleep, I was planning, calculating. I knew now that leaving him wasn't a question of if. It was when and how. I wasn't going to be one of those women who made a big scene, screaming and sobbing as he packed a bag. No, I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I wanted him to wake up one day and find me gone. No note.
No goodbye. No explanation.
Just absence. I wanted him to feel that hollow space where I used to be and know it was his fault. The first step was money. He always prided himself on taking care of me, which was his polite way of saying he controlled the finances. Our accounts were shared. But somehow I never had full access. I had a debit card, but I didn't know the online banking passwords. That was about to change. I waited until he left for work one morning, then sat at the kitchen table with my phone in hand. I knew enough about him to guess the answers to his security questions. First pet? His childhood dog, Mac's mother's maiden name? Reynolds. High school mascot? The Wildcats. 3 tries. 3 hits. People like him always think they're smarter than they are. Once I was in, I transferred small amounts of money into a separate account I'd opened a week earlier. Nothing too obvious. 50 here, 100 there. Just enough to make it look like everyday expenses. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was a start. Next was paperwork. I pulled out every important document I could think of. Birth certificate, marriage license, insurance policies. I scanned them all and sent copies to a new email I'd created for myself. An email he didn't know existed. He never checked our home files, never even glanced at them. His mind was too busy elsewhere. On her. I didn't think about her much during those days. It wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about comparing myself to her or wondering what she had that I didn't. I knew that if it wasn't her, it would have been someone else. Men like him never stop searching. I could have been perfect and it still wouldn't have been enough. That realization hurt less than I thought it would. Gave me clarity. There were moments, though, where I felt the old version of me fighting to come back. The version that wanted to confront him, to demand he tell me every detail, every lie, every time he saw her. But I knew better now. What would that get me? Another lie. Another hollow "I'm sorry." I didn't want apologies. I wanted freedom. One night, about 2 weeks after I found the book, I lay in bed and glanced at him. He was scrolling on his phone, eyes half closed, his thumb lazily flicking up the screen. I stared at him for a long time, really seeing him for the first time in a while. He looked so ordinary. His hair was a little messy, his t-shirt wrinkled from lounging on the couch. There was nothing remarkable about him in that moment. I wondered how I'd ever seen him as larger than life. How had I ever been so blind? I used to love that man. I used to think he was my best friend. Now he just looked small. He glanced up and caught me staring. "What?" he asked with a small grin, still half focused on his phone. "Nothing," I said, rolling onto my side. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how much things have changed." He snorted a little laugh. "Yeah, life's like that." Then he looked back down at his phone, not even realizing what I meant. Not even realizing I was already gone. The days passed faster than I expected. Each one felt like one less link in the chain holding me here. I started cleaning out my things little by little. Not enough for him to notice. Just a sweater here, a pair of shoes there. I took them to a storage unit I'd rented a few miles away. The woman at the counter didn't ask any questions when I paid cash. I appreciated that. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my friends, not my family. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that the more people you tell, the more risk you take. I wasn't going to risk it. People love to accidentally spill secrets. I wasn't giving anyone the chance to sabotage me, even by accident. On a Thursday morning, I packed a suitcase. Just one. Enough clothes to get me through a few weeks. I folded everything neatly, slowly, with the kind of care you give to something you'll never see again. Each fold felt like a promise to myself. A vow. He left for work as usual that morning, not suspecting a thing. He kissed me on the cheek before he walked out, just like he used to before I knew. His lips felt cold. "See you tonight," he said, grabbing his keys. "Yeah," I said, giving him a soft smile. "See you tonight." But he wouldn't. As soon as I heard his car pull away, I moved. I didn't stop. I carried my suitcase to the car, checking over my shoulder every few seconds as if he might suddenly reappear. I didn't breathe until the trunk was closed, the engine was on, and I was driving away from that house. I didn't cry. I expected to cry, but I didn't. I felt light, weightless, like I'd shed all the heaviness I'd been carrying for months. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my knuckles pale with the force of it, but I didn't care. I just drove. I didn't go to a friend's house. I didn't go to my parents'. I went somewhere he wouldn't think to look. A little motel on the edge of town with peeling paint and an old neon sign that buzzed faintly. I paid for a week in cash. No paper trail.
No receipts.
The woman at the front desk gave me a key without asking questions. Another quiet ally in my escape. The room was small but clean. A bed, a chair, a TV bolted to the wall. I sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. I stared at the ceiling, letting the quiet settle in. I knew he'd call. Not right away, but eventually. When he realized I wasn't home. When he noticed the little things I'd taken. I wondered what his face would look like when he opened the closet and saw the space where my clothes used to be. I wondered if he'd call Taylor first. Probably. I didn't care. I turned off my phone that night and tossed it in the bottom of my suitcase. I didn't need to hear his voice. I didn't need to hear his excuses, his fake concern, his half-hearted attempts to reel me back in. I knew how that conversation would go. I'd heard it play out 1,000 times in my head, but this time I'd won. He would come home to an empty house. He'd call my name. He'd check the bedroom, the kitchen, the bathroom. He'd check his phone, scrolling through our last messages, wondering if he missed a sign. He'd sit on the edge of the bed, just like I had so many nights before. He'd stare at the space where I used to be, and for the first time he would feel it. That hollow aching absence. The kind that doesn't go away. The kind that keeps you awake at night. I hoped it kept him awake forever. I stayed at that motel longer than I expected. At first, I told myself it would just be for a few nights, a temporary escape while I figured out my next move. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that I wasn't just running away from him. I was shedding the version of myself that had been molded around him. Piece by piece, I was unraveling her. The woman who made excuses. The woman who waited. The woman who stayed. Every morning, I woke up to the quiet hum of the old air conditioning unit by the window.
No alarms.
No footsteps down the hall. No sound of him brushing his teeth in the bathroom, humming whatever song had been stuck in his head. Just me. Just silence. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I got up slowly, taking my time. I made coffee with the little motel coffee maker, even though it tasted like cardboard. I sat by the window watching cars pass on the highway. It was a strange kind of peace. I thought about calling someone. My sister, maybe. She'd always told me I deserved better. But I'd waved her off back then, saying, "You don't understand. He's a good man. He's just stressed." God, I hate how stupid I was. But I didn't call her. I didn't call anyone. Not yet. I didn't want to explain myself. I didn't want to hear the pity in their voices or the well-meaning offers to help me figure things out. This was my mess to clean up, and I didn't need anyone watching me do it. On the third day, I bought a new phone. A cheap prepaid one with no contracts, no ties, no traceable history. I left my old phone off, buried deep in the suitcase under layers of clothes. I didn't delete anything on it, didn't even check it. Let him call it. Let him text it. Let him wonder why I wasn't answering. I liked the idea of him sitting there, waiting for a reply that would never come. I spent the next week figuring out my next move. I needed a plan, a real one, not just stay in a motel and hope for the best. The money I'd moved into my account wasn't much, But it was enough to buy me time. Time was the most valuable thing I had now. Every day I stayed away was a reminder to myself that I could do this. I could be alone. But on the fifth night something changed. It was late, probably around midnight, and I was half asleep when I heard it. A knock. Soft at first, like someone testing the weight of their hand against the door. My eyes shot open, my heart instantly on fire in my chest. For a second I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 knocks. I sat up slowly, breathing as quietly as I could. My pulse was pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. Who would be knocking at this hour? My mind immediately jumped to him. Was it him? Had he found me? No, that was impossible. I'd been so careful. Another knock. Louder. More impatient. I moved quietly, bare feet on the worn motel carpet. I pressed my eye against the peephole. A man. Not him. Just a man I didn't recognize. Middle-aged, scruffy beard. Baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He rocked back on his heels, hands in his pockets, looking like he was trying to seem casual but not quite pulling it off. Who is it? I called through the door, voice sharp and steady. There was a pause. Then, maintenance. I didn't answer. I just kept watching him. He didn't have any tools.
No uniform. No clipboard.
Just a hoodie and jeans. Wrong room, I said firmly. Try again. He stayed there for a few seconds, shifting from one foot to the other like he was trying to decide something. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away down the hall. I stood there for a long time, ear pressed to the door, waiting for his footsteps to fade completely. When I finally moved away, my hands were shaking. I double-checked the lock, the chain, the latch. It was all secure, but it didn't feel like enough. I sat on the bed, back against the wall, watching the door like it might grow teeth. I didn't sleep that night. By morning I'd made up my mind. The motel had been safe at first, but now it felt like a trap. I packed up everything, folded my clothes neatly into the suitcase, and zipped it shut with finality. I didn't look back at the room as I left. Just walked to my car, got in and drove. No music.
No GPS.
Just the sound of the road under the tires and the steady thump of my heart in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay still anymore. People who stay still get found. People who stay still get hurt. I ended up 3 towns away in a little apartment complex that smelled like fresh paint and wet concrete. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and it was mine. I signed a short-term lease under a name I hadn't used since college, my middle name and my mother's maiden name. They didn't ask too many questions and I didn't offer too many answers. I paid the deposit in cash. The first night there I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall with no furniture. No TV, no distractions. Just me, a suitcase, and the quiet buzz of streetlights outside the window. For the first time in weeks I cried. Not the soft, silent kind of crying you do when you're trying to hold it together. No, this was the kind that breaks you open. The kind that makes your whole body shake, your breath come in gasps, your face wet and raw from rubbing it with your hands. I cried for everything. For every version of myself that had believed him. For every lie I'd swallowed to keep the peace. For every night I'd waited for him to come home, thinking I just needed to be patient. I cried because I realized I'd loved him more than he'd ever loved me. I cried because it wasn't fair. But when it was over I felt lighter. Not happy, not relieved, just empty. And sometimes empty is enough. The next few weeks were quiet. I got a part-time job at a little coffee shop a few blocks away. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid in cash tips every night, and that was all I cared about. I met people. Nice people. People who didn't ask too many questions. People who only knew me as Anna, the quiet girl who always worked the morning shift. Sometimes I wondered what he was doing. If he was looking for me. If he'd called Taylor, asked if she'd seen me, or if he'd just given up. Maybe he was angry. Maybe he wasn't. I stopped caring after a while. I realized it didn't matter what he felt. It only mattered that he wasn't here. But then one night as I was walking back to my apartment from work, I saw it. A car. Parked down the street. Black. Tinted windows. It wasn't there yesterday. I walked slower, watching it out of the corner of my eye. No one got out. The engine wasn't running, but something about it made my skin crawl. When I got to my door, I unlocked it as calmly as I could, stepping inside with slow, deliberate movements. I didn't turn on the lights. I locked the door behind me, flipped the deadbolt and slid the chain into place. Then I sat in the dark, peeking through the blinds. The car didn't move. I sat there for hours. My legs went numb. My eyes burned from staring too long. Eventually the car pulled away.
No headlights.
No sound. Just the slow roll of tires on pavement. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I called the leasing office. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Can I get a copy of the security camera footage from last night?" The woman on the phone hesitated. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, swallowing the dryness in my throat. "Just being careful." I hung up and sat at the kitchen table, tapping my fingers against the wood. If it was him, I would know soon. If it wasn't, well, paranoia has a way of feeling just like instinct. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: instinct is rarely wrong. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't like before, where I could convince myself it was just nerves or leftover paranoia. No, this was something different. It was heavier, like the air itself had grown dense, pressing down on me with every step I took. I kept looking over my shoulder on my walk to the coffee shop. Every car that passed felt like it was moving too slowly. Every figure on the sidewalk felt too close. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me after seeing that car the night before. But deep down I knew better. At work, I tried to focus on the rhythm of making lattes and pouring drip coffee. It helped for a while. The hiss of the steam wand, the soft clinking of mugs against the counter. It drowned out the noise in my head. The customers didn't notice anything was wrong. They never do. People see what they want to see. "Rough night?" asked Maya, one of my coworkers. She leaned against the counter next to me, popping a piece of gum in her mouth. "Yeah," I said, not offering any details. People like Maya mean well, but they also like to dig. I'd learned to keep my answers short. "You should sleep more," she said, nudging me with her elbow. "Those bags under your eyes are doing you no favors, girl." I forced a smile. "Yeah, I'll work on that." The rest of the shift passed slowly, like time had been stretched thin. I checked my phone during my break, scrolling through nothing, just for the comfort of movement. No missed calls, no messages. Not that I was expecting any. I hadn't given anyone my new number. The old phone was still off, stuffed at the bottom of my suitcase, like a time capsule of a life I didn't want to open. After work, I lingered outside for a bit, pretending to scroll through my phone while my eyes scanned the street. No black car. No strange figures. Just normal people living their normal lives. I felt stupid for even looking. But I looked anyway. On the walk home, I kept my keys in my hand, one poking between my fingers like a makeshift weapon. It wasn't much, but it made me feel like I had some control. Every step felt heavier than the last. I kept my head down, hoodie pulled up, pretending I didn't exist. I didn't look at anyone's face, didn't give them a reason to remember mine. But halfway home I saw it, parked on the corner like it had every right to be there. The black car. Same tinted windows. Same stillness, like a predator waiting for its prey to look away. My heart went cold, a numb chill spreading from my chest to my fingertips. This time I didn't stop walking. I didn't freeze. I didn't even turn my head. I kept moving, kept my breathing steady, but my eyes locked on it in my peripheral vision. No one got out. No one rolled down the window. It just sat there, silent and watching. I wanted to run. Every part of me screamed run. But I didn't. I knew better than that. If you run, they follow. If you run, they know you're afraid. Instead, I walked past my apartment complex. Just kept walking. I didn't even glance toward my building. If someone was watching me, I wasn't going to lead them home. My heart was pounding in my ears, drowning out every other sound. I made it another 2 blocks before I ducked into a grocery store. Inside, I pretended to shop. I picked up a loaf of bread, set it down. Picked up a jar of peanut butter, set it down. I glanced behind me every chance I got, scanning the faces of the people walking past. No one looked familiar. No one looked suspicious. But then again, they never do. I stayed in that store for nearly an hour, moving slowly through every aisle like I was shopping for a feast. My mind was racing the entire time. What if it wasn't him? What if it was just some guy waiting for his friend, scrolling on his phone, not even thinking about me? But what if it wasn't? When I finally left, I took a different route home. I zigzagged through side streets, doubled back once or twice just to be sure. My heart didn't stop racing until I was standing in front of my apartment door. Even then I didn't relax. I unlocked it quickly, slipped inside and bolted every lock behind me. I leaned against the door, eyes closed, trying to catch my breath. My fingers were still shaking. "You're fine," I whispered to myself. "You're fine. Nobody followed you. You're fine." But I didn't feel fine. That night I barely slept. I lay on the mattress, eyes open, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. Every creak of the building, every distant car horn, every muffled voice from a neighbor's TV made me flinch. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate. But when I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. By the next morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to be afraid anymore. I wasn't going to wait for something to happen. If he thought he could scare me, he'd underestimated me. I walked to the leasing office as soon as it opened. The woman behind the counter, Marcy, smiled at me like she did every morning. I'd spoken to her a few times when I signed my lease. She seemed kind, a little too chatty but kind. "Hey Anna, what's up?" she asked, setting her coffee down. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Can I see the security footage from last night?" Her smile faltered just a bit. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, elite. Just curious. I think I saw someone hanging around the lot and wanted to make sure it wasn't anything weird." Her eyes narrowed in concern. "Creeps, huh? Yeah, I get that. Hold on, let me pull it up." She tapped at her keyboard, frowning at the screen.